Are we moving towards the armed conflict? I'm Asli Atbas, international news producer at TRT World London, and I will be your moderator for this evening. Let me introduce you our host, Circle Foundation. It's a non-profit, independent, and non-partisan think tank based in London, dedicated to innovative studies on national, regional, and international issues, with a particular focus on the UK-Turkey relations. Let's start with the latest on the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Tensions could soon reach a breaking point as both sides appear to be preparing for an invasion. Ukraine has asked its citizens to leave Russia immediately and approved plans for a national state of emergency. And Russia has started to evacuate its diplomatic staff from Ukraine. Meanwhile, the European Union, United Kingdom, and the United States have all announced sanctions on Russia, with many warning this is just the start. To further discuss these latest developments tonight here, joining me are Andry Marchenko, Deputy Head of Ukrainian Mission in the United Kingdom, Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and former US Ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan, Professor Angela Stent, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Asli Aydintasbas, Senior Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and Global Opinion columnist at Washington Post. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So our panel will start with a roundtable discussions with our guests, and we will move on to your questions. So please feel free to join us and leave your questions in the chat box. I will be checking them, and we will have 20 minutes for your questions. So we have lots to talk about tonight. So I would like to start our panel discussion now. Professor Angela Stent, I would like to start with you. So speaking about sanctions, President Putin said on Monday that the West would impose sanctions no matter what anyways, and that wouldn't change Russia's position. But is that really the case here? Do you think all these sanctions will affect Russia's possible decision to send troops into Ukraine?
Well, first of all, Russia already has sent troops into Ukraine. Let's remember, Russia and Ukraine have been at war since 2014, even though the Russians denied at that time that they had Russian soldiers there. So sanctions were imposed in 2014 on Russia, financial sanctions, other sanctions, and they hurt Russia economically, but they obviously didn't really change Russian policy, although one could have argued at that time maybe they stopped the Russians from taking more territory. Putin and the people around him have already discounted sanctions. If you watch the extraordinary speech he gave on Sunday night, denigrating Ukrainians, attacking the United States, a very, very aggressive speech, you can see from that the threat of sanctions aren't really going to change his calculus and what he's going to do. The sanctions that have been imposed now in the last couple of days are certainly going to hurt some of the people around him. They're not going to like it. The banking sanctions that have been introduced and the sanctions on Russia's sovereign debt will certainly hurt Russia. But he seems to now be in a mood where none of this is going to stop him if he does indeed want to have a full-scale invasion. There's already been a partial one, and go on to Kyiv.
Asli, I will come to you very soon on the European response, but speaking about President Putin's aggressive talk on Monday, Ambassador Herbst, I want to ask you a question about that speech. In that speech, Putin said he was promised by the US 20 years ago that the NATO would not expand, but it has expanded 5 times since then. Do you think if NATO changed his mind on its eastwards expansion, would this change the situation? Do you think Putin's security concerns have a base here?
Well, first of all, you can be sure that Putin was never assured by the United States or key NATO members that there would be no NATO expansion. We've never made that promise at any time, including going back to the early 90s. This current crisis is not just about NATO. It's clever for Putin to focus on NATO when he talks about this to try and justify his aggression. But we need to remember that this whole thing began in late 2013 because Moscow objected to Ukraine concluding a trade agreement with the EU. That's how this all started. And if Moscow had not objected to that trade agreement, I suspect Yanukovych would have finished his term and someone else would now be president, but by normal means. And if you look at all the things that Mr. Putin has said and that Russian officials have said over the past 2 months, you see that they have these very large ambitions to restore Russian influence throughout not just the post-Soviet space, the former Soviet Union, but the post-Soviet empire space. You know, the demands they made regarding the demilitarization of Eastern NATO allies is a demonstration of what they want to do. The things that Putin described in terms of the states that emerged from the Soviet collapse suggest that he has his eye on them too, despite his assurances over the last 2 days to a couple of leaders of some of the other states. So he wants to rewrite the end of the Cold War, and he's willing to do that via coercion. And that's what this is all about. So it's not just about NATO. And also one more very important thing. The West, or rather NATO, the original NATO members as they existed at the end of the Cold War, are not the reason why NATO enlarged. This was a process driven by countries that wanted to join NATO because they were afraid of Moscow's imperial ambitions. And sadly, though, they were right. Those imperial ambitions are right now on display in Ukraine.
Thank you. Asli, European response was Germany announcing that they will stop the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from operating. Now, while this is quite a big hit to Russia, the European Union is also going to suffer greatly with an increase in gas prices. Do you think they can go further with this decision?
I think so. Whatever Putin's intentions were about stopping NATO expansion, he's done the opposite of what he intended to do, really solidified NATO unity. And we saw that on display at Munich this past weekend when there was more transatlantic solidarity than there was for a number of years. And very strong speeches by not just German foreign minister and French leaders, of course, and Kamala Harris, but also Ursula von der Leyen, who has emerged as a lead figure in this firm European response. Europeans were slow to come around. Initially, remember in early January, you basically had Americans going around screaming, wait a minute, Russia is going to invade Ukraine, and everyone sort of rolled their eyes. But within a couple of weeks, I think everyone had come around to the same conclusion. Again, very firm response from UK as well. Once again, bringing Britain closer to EU since Brexit. I do think that that the Nord Stream 2 decision was important. Germany did come around and came around fairly early. There was no debate, argument, even though there is an argument inside Germany, there was no argument on the part of the German government in terms of whether or not recognition of these two states in Donbass were actually full invasion, half invasion, or not incursion. They came around very firmly by canceling Nord Stream 2. Now, the challenge for Europe and US will be to supply, to come up with alternatives, because it's very clear that without Nord Stream 2 and with the possibility of downsizing Russian gas over the next few months, there will be need for Europe to provide supplies, natural gas supplies to Europe. And I think there's a big scramble right now, particularly with Gulf countries and Qatar trying to find gas, natural gas for Europe. But again, to go back to my earlier point, Putin has achieved the opposite of what he wanted to achieve. Until over the last few years, we've been talking about decoupling between Europe and Europe. And now it's, transatlantic unity seems to be very strong right now.
Thank you. I see Mr. Andrei Mirchenko joining us. I would like to ask you Ukraine's view on this sanctions. So Ukraine has been asking the West to impose sanctions on Russia since the moment Russian troops amassed their border. Now the sanctions have been imposed. Are you satisfied with this? And what does Ukraine expect the international community to handle this situation?
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. First of all, I would say that perhaps Ukraine has been very long talking about sanctions on Russia. As a matter of fact, we have been talking about sanctions and increasing sanctions from the first day the war began in 2014. And we never ceased, just as much as the war never ceased, to continue in Ukrainian territory. Now, before this blatant violation of international law that Putin has committed on Monday, by recognizing these bogus quasi-republics, the West, including the European Union and the United States and the United Kingdom, promised that the sanctions would be massive, overpowering, and they would be very, very swift. What we have seen is something we are grateful for. However, we do not really, I do not feel, for one, that these sanctions are something to stop Putin. I think that in this case, and Putin has, not just Putin, but Russia in general, in every war that it has ever started, and there have been many, that they will move on until they are stopped. And in order to stop them, I think that these sanctions are hardly enough. And I understand, I also support what the previous speakers have said about this much, that Putin is probably not looking very seriously at these sanctions. They are mostly just the beginning. And we understand that these sanctions are just phase one of sanctions that are being introduced. And the West is probably pursuing the tactic of persuading Putin to stop at these sanctions now, so that the sanctions do not become worse. And of course, the West, I'm sure, has more sanctions up their sleeve to introduce just as soon as Putin decides to move forward. Now, about moving forward, I am afraid that he has not stopped already at the steps that he has taken on Monday, because even today alone we have seen 75 violations of the ceasefire, and there has been shelling of Ukrainian territory. I hear one civilian has been injured in the shellings, and the shelling has been going on in several places across the contact line in Donbass. So I think that it is just a matter of discerning when to introduce the next phase of sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Stent, we've just heard from Ambassador Herbst that all this crisis is not about NATO's expansion, but I would like to take your view on this. Let's say Ukraine dropped its request to be a NATO member and NATO has stopped its eastward expansion. Do you think then Russia would pull its troops out and respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and end its so-called peacekeeping mission?
Well, I agree with Ambassador Herbst completely that this is really about much more than Ukraine and NATO. So the short answer is, if President Zelensky tomorrow said Ukraine is never going to seek NATO membership, that wouldn't change anything that's happening there. I go back to what I said at the beginning. This is about Putin's desire to subjugate Ukraine, and NATO is just part of that. So Putin has used the arguments about NATO expansion. And again, I want to underline, no promises were made to Russia at the time of German unification that NATO would not enlarge. They were talking at that point about NATO troops being stationed on the territory of the former East Germany. So a lot of this is an urban myth, and you can go and look in the records and you can see that this really didn't happen like that. But what Putin is trying to do is to restore a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, to restrict the choices of Russia's neighbors as to what they can do in terms of foreign policy. He already now has, of course, a very close relationship with Belarus because President Lukashenko has to depend on him completely to stay in power. But if you look at the treaties that were presented to the US and NATO in December, the Russians are also asking that NATO retreat to its pre-1997 military posture, which before the first round of enlargement. So this is really about having a sphere of influence, not only in the post-Soviet space, but possibly in Central and Eastern Europe again. And again, to reiterate what Ambassador Herbst said, this is about relitigating the end of the Cold War. It's about restoring Russia essentially to the position it had when it was the Soviet Union, minus the, it won't recreate the Soviet Union, but certainly to be treated as such and to have a sphere of influence as such. Ukraine is the immediate objective, obviously, and the terrible things we're seeing now, but the goals are much broader. And so I think, if NATO as a whole said tomorrow, we're not going to enlarge anymore, I don't think that would change what Putin's doing.
Thank you. So we have been seeing a lot of diplomacy going on since this crisis started, but they haven't seemed to be quite successful so far. So I would like to turn to Ambassador Herbst here. Both President and Putin and President Zelensky still say they are open to diplomacy, but the US has called off the meeting that was supposed to take place between Putin and Biden. Do you think this indicates that the US does not think that a diplomatic solution could be reached?
A diplomatic solution can be reached once Putin decides he does not want to enhance or further his current aggression in Ukraine. One needs to keep in mind that diplomacy is not just the meeting of officials, it's also the refusal to meet officials. The Biden administration responded, I think, properly with some strong sanctions yesterday, and also with the decision to further increase NATO's force posture in the East. And this was a very clear diplomatic signal, as well as another signal to the Kremlin that they'll face further problems if they invade deeper in Ukraine. Blinken was right to call off the meeting for tomorrow with Lavrov, saying we need to have some sign of good faith from the Russians. And of course, Putin's response to our sanctions and now their position that the area they believe the occupied territories of Ukraine should include are the rest of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. So we see the scab that they're going to pick on in the future. Again, so the most important thing we can do is push back hard with our allies and partners on Kremlin intimidation and aggression, and wait for them to recognize that they have to talk to us to achieve a reasonable solution to this.
Thank you. Speaking about diplomatic talks and mediation efforts, Asli, several leaders are in talks with both Russia and Moscow, but one of them has a unique position here, and that's Turkey. So Erdogan have met with both leaders, like he had phone calls with both Putin and Zelensky. And what do you think will come out of these meetings? And what is Turkey's position in this latest crisis?
Well, I don't really think Turkish mediation will be possible, in part because President Putin does not seem open to it. I think Zelensky has made it clear publicly and privately that he's willing to come to Istanbul. He said it as late as Saturday in Munich. And, he's repeated it again and asked for also Turkish mediation. But I think Putin has made it very clear. There was a phone call between President Erdogan and President Putin this afternoon. I don't know what they spoke about. The readout does tell us that Erdogan did say that did try to persuade at least Putin for a Turkish role and to continue with diplomacy. It also does reaffirm Turkey's position that it does not recognize Russia's recognition of these. It rejects Russia's recognition of these two states. Having said all that, Turkey's position, I think, is particularly difficult, and it's going to be a difficult and challenging balancing act. On the one hand, there's no doubt that Ukraine is a very special friend to Turkey. Maybe some of our listeners don't know, but it's one of the few places really anywhere that you can travel even without a passport. As it is, even tonight, there are flights to Kiev and many other Ukrainian cities from Istanbul with Turkish Airlines. And not just that, of course, there's sort of this historic affinity, but which is now translated into a defense relationship that seems mutually beneficial. People know that Turkey has been selling drones to Ukraine, But there's also the flip side, which is working with Ukraine for Turkey's own defense projects, not to mention, trade and historic affinity. Having said all that, I think Russia has also become a huge friend. I say that with a slight pause, and I'll explain that. Russia has become an important partner. Turkey does rely on Russia to operate in Syria. There's no doubt about that it's with the Russian green light that successive Turkish incursions in Syria have taken place. And it also holds sort of a very key issue, which is the refugee flows. We've seen how Russian incursions or sort of offensives in Idlib or Syrian regime offensives in Idlib, in the last stronghold, opposition stronghold in Syria, have actually resulted in refugee flows to Turkey. There's also a dependency when it comes to natural gas. So my sense is that Turkey will try to support Ukraine, but stay out of sanctions. I cannot see, given Turkey's own economic situation and dependency on Russian natural gas, I cannot see Turkey joining with Western sanctions on Ukraine. And that's not really an exceptional position for Turkey, by the way. It's always gotten some type of an exception when it was a question of sanctions by the West. It has never joined, or it has had serious exceptions when it came to sanctions on Iran, and has not joined the sanctions, Western sanctions on Crimea. So I think that Turkey will stay out of sanctions, but there will be all types of challenges in terms of, there's no doubt, I should also say this outright, there's no doubt that Turkey is not happy with what's happening. I think that Russian expansion north with Russian presence in Syria and a stronger Russian position in the Caucasus, you'd have to be blind to the fact that, Russia is flexing its muscles on Turkey's borders, basically. And I think that does create some level of nervousness. But again, the economic dependency on Russia has made it very difficult for Ankara to be very forthright on this issue. My sense is that President Erdogan will try to mediate in this crisis until, as long as he can, keep making that offer. He will try to go along, step up maybe NATO engagement in Eastern Europe, in other parts of Eastern Europe. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a balancing act. There will be questions about Black Sea too. But there too, Montreux Convention of 1938 makes it very difficult for Turkey to actually close off the Black Sea, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles to Russian or other Ukrainian ships. So I think that Turkey will probably keep supporting the Ukrainians militarily, but in terms of what it's already been doing, but not really but tread carefully when it comes to relations with Russia.
Thank you so much. You have talked about Russia's decision to recognize the independence of these two breakaway regions in Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. So I would like to ask a question to Professor Stent on this. Professor Stent, how much more power does having troops in this region give Russia? And what do you make of Russia describing these soldiers as peacemakers?
Well, Russia has had a tradition really since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've seen this in the area of Transnistria. We saw it earlier in Nagorno-Karabakh, before the recent war. And we obviously have seen it in Georgia in terms of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, is that the Russians send in so-called peacekeeping troops to countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, and they use them either just to support Russian interests there or to support these breakaway regions. The recognition of these two entities inside Ukraine, it doesn't mean anything internationally or diplomatically, because probably there aren't going to be any or very few other countries that will recognize them, except for the other separatist enclaves in the post-Soviet space. And the troops that have been sent in there, it appears to be, and there's some ambiguity here, and maybe the ambassador could say more about that, but it seems to me that the Russians are now saying that they have the right, or these independent entities, so-called, have the right to take control of the entire territory of these areas in the Donbass, because of course the Russian proxy forces that are there don't control the whole territory. And so that will still involve hostilities with the Ukrainian armed forces if these Russian so-called peacekeepers try to take the rest of those territories.
Thank you so much for your answer. Ambassador Herbst, I see you smiling there on this question as well. Do you want to give us an answer on this question? How do you see Russia's decision recognizing these independence of these breakaway regions?
I would like to address that, but in a slightly broader frame. I think the question everybody is asking is, where does Putin stop in this current crisis? Are we going to see the large invasion, the move to Kyiv that the US government keeps talking about, or will he settle roughly for what he's done right now? I've been somewhat skeptical of the big invasion expectations, although I don't rule it out. What I think, though, we've seen is Putin has set up as the conclusion to this round of his aggression, and the conclusion of this round does not mean he will stop committing aggression beyond. I think what we're seeing is the emergence once again of the scenario we have in Georgia. And the question you ask about the territories in the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, which he is making a claim on, suggests that he may be quite happy to do in the east of Ukraine what he did in southern Ossetia in 2008. He agreed on a ceasefire after feinting towards Tbilisi. And then he agreed to a line of contact between the territory controlled by the Southern Ossetians and the rest of Georgia, you might say. And then what we've seen since 2008 is every so often they move that line of contact a couple of meters further into the rest of Georgia. And in the case of Georgia, that has not provoked any response from the West whatsoever. And he may see this as a relatively cost-free, a low-risk way to keep pressure on Ukraine. And I think that is perhaps going to be the most likely outcome of this current crisis. But again, I can't rule out something much larger and much uglier, because I was really struck by not just the total belligerence of Putin's remarks on Monday, but even his demeanor. And his pattern as a statesman has always been to take carefully calibrated risks. And if he stops with what he's done, this will be consistent with the pattern. Because even though I've been skeptical of the big invasion, I always said the easiest thing for him to do is what he just did. But maybe because he has this idée fixe, this obsession with Ukraine, which again, both the intemperate language and his general demeanor suggest, maybe he will do something more risky and, of course, which much more dangerous. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I would like to move to our next guest, Mr. Andrei Mirchenko. Sir, first of all, your camera is not at the right position.
It's not.
Yeah, do you think maybe you can turn that over? Yes, much better.
What about this?
We can see you much better.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I would like to ask you, what does Ukraine see as the way out of this crisis?
Well, it's a very general question, of course, but I say that as you all can observe, there is very little that can stop the Russian Federation and under Putin. Right now, I think what could stop him would be a very strong response. And by a very strong response, I mean a serious commitment to sanctions all the way, plus perhaps some more things. I think that really Nord Stream 2 suspension, I wouldn't stop that. I wouldn't think that it has been stopped entirely, but even suspension was a bit of a surprise for him because he counted on Germany to just continue in its previous track. I think that first of all, what Ukraine and the West need to show him is the unity that has developed over this past several months, the resolve that has been expressed before. It has to be actually put in practice, and all of these strong sanctions that have been pledged should go ahead, and they should go ahead overwhelmingly, much in the same way as Putin's troops are now overwhelmingly hanging over Ukraine's borders on all sides. Plus, as already Ambassador Herbst has pointed out, Putin has revealed quite an hysterical speech on Monday night. So it is perhaps a signal to the whole world that he is not stopping at anything unless, of course, he's stopped. What I think, going back to Georgia, if I remember correctly, he did try to take Tbilisi, however, retracted after quite substantial losses in equipment when they started losing planes to Georgian surface-to-air rockets. So perhaps if the huge amount of losses that he suffers in case he moves ahead will make him stop at some point. Because when bodies start to be transported back to Russia of Russian servicemen, it will cause quite a stir among Russian public, which I think tends to be quite indifferent to what's happening right now. And but of course, this is a very the scenario that we do not want to unfold, because a conflict like this in our own territory is not something we want, and we do not want to go to war with them, because we don't want to go to war, period. And we have been very clear on this. We have never had any plans to approach from the military point of view the liberation of the occupied territories. We made repeated statements on this over these past 8 years, not to mention this past several months and weeks. So the best option would be to just make a concerted action by Ukraine and the West, the rest of the world, Turkey included, to make clear signals to Putin that he has to stop, that it's time to stop. And as we have seen time and again, the signals that we send must be powerful ones, because he only listens to power and he only listens to force. I guess personal sanctions that are being introduced have to be expanded, and they have to include his closest, so to work. People have to start asking him questions inside Russia: what is happening, why it is happening, and so on. So I think the way to stop him, unless we of course want to use force, which it doesn't look like a very likely scenario, is to employ very, very harsh sanctions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We have been receiving a lot of questions from our guests, but before moving on to the questions, I would like to ask one final question to Ambassador Herbst. So do you think the US and Russia can build a new relationship based on trust? And do you think that would change the situation right now we are witnessing between Moscow and Kiev?
I am happy to say that after many years, it looks like the United States government has a pretty good bead on what Putin is up to. The Biden administration has been learning on the job that trying to establish a stable and predictable relationship with Moscow is not possible given Putin's aggressive revisionist designs. And so they're pushing back very hard. Because Russia is in fact much weaker than the United States, and even weaker than that vis-a-vis the West combined, strong policy from the West will ultimately persuade Putin and any government in Moscow to cease this course. Once Moscow realizes that aggression abroad and repression at home is not good for the country, we will be able to establish a relationship, not just a business-like relationship, but a relationship of cooperation. But that's going to require a period of strong US and Western pushback against Moscow's aggression. And we're seeing that now. I think the sanctions that Biden announced yesterday were very strong and will help achieve this objective. It looks like Biden has finally let the scales fall from his eyes on Nord Stream 2 and is going to make it go kaput forever today. And I strongly welcome that. And that is a major blow to Putin. And again, if we are resolute, we, the United States, with our partners, we can change over time Putin's calculus. Hopefully that will be before he launches a major new offensive in Ukraine. And I think there's a pretty good chance of that too, although it's by no means certain. And in fact, let me add one more thing. I said that before that I was a little bit disconcerted by not just what Putin said on Monday, but his demeanor. The fact that not just on Monday, but back in December, when Moscow sent to the United States and to NATO those draft treaties with the demands to demilitarize the eastern part of the NATO alliance and the expectation that Moscow should have control over the post-Soviet space and the post-Soviet empire space, suggests a real tactical mistake. Because Putin, in every crisis that he has created, with Georgia, with Ukraine, go back to Crimea, and now this, he's relied on people to think, this is just about this one specific issue, therefore let's give it to him. But he laid out his broad agenda in broad daylight. And that's a tactical error of some significance, which suggests that he's losing his touch, which could be dangerous.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to move on to questions from our guests. And my first question will be to Professor Stent. Professor Stent, they are asking you if you think Putin is engaging this conflict with caution because he's losing his popularity among Russians, since Russian economy have had a significant impact due to COVID-19 pandemic.
So I think one of the main reasons why Putin is doing this now, and again, to reiterate what Ambassador Herbst said, I mean, all of these complaints, demands, and grievances have been there, at least on paper, since the Munich Security Conference speech he gave 15 years ago. I think the reason he's doing it now has to do with his perception of weakness in the West. He looks at the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. He looks at the United States deeply divided politically, a Biden administration having difficulty getting its legislative agenda through, a German government that is still forming and trying to agree on a foreign policy, France preoccupied with election, Europe in general, Britain having obviously its own problems. So he looks at a weak West, and that's why he's doing it now. Yes, his popularity rates are now, I think, at 68%. And after the Crimean annexation, it was 80%. But he still has a very firm grip on power. I mean, the Russian state has become increasingly repressive. Most of his opponents are either in prison or in exile. And yes, the Russian economy has suffered, partly as a result of sanctions, partly as a result of COVID. But he still has over $600 billion of hard currency reserves. And the Russian economy has kind of insulated itself in many ways against outside shocks. I'm sure that there will be grumbling, obviously, if the economic situation deteriorates in Russia, but he will then blame the West for it. And a majority of Russians blame the United States and NATO for this crisis, particularly those people who only watch state-run media. I think the domestic aspect of it, which I am puzzled about, is the Russian media have not prepared the public for a war with Ukraine. they're blaming the West for the crisis, but they're saying we don't want a war. And Putin, as we know, has written this 5,000-word essay in July telling Russians that Ukrainian Russians are one people, etc. If there's a large-scale war, and if they really do go to Kyiv, and if you then have to have thousands of Russian troops and casualties and body bags going back, this would not be a popular war in Russia. There is no appetite inside Russia to go to war with Ukraine. And I just wonder whether that constrains him at all now. I don't know.
Thank you very much. Asli, you've actually talked about Turkey's role in this crisis, but we have some further questions about that. So President Erdogan has told Putin he would not accept any move against Ukraine's sovereignty. How significant is this? And can President Erdogan, as both a friend to Russia and NATO member, play a useful role? And the other question on this is, today the Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey has asked Turkey to close the Bosphorus Strait, as you have already mentioned, and how this would affect the Montreux Convention.
I think it's very clear that President Putin does not want to negotiate. So for Turkey to be able to play a role using Erdogan using his relationship with Putin, he has to be part of it. He has to play ball. And it's clear that he's not been open to negotiations, not on Minsk, not on any other element. And I think that, the sort of Putin's decision from the get-go was to talk to Americans and Americans only, not NATO, not Europeans, and also not Turkey. So I think the negotiation role for Turkey is not in the cards precisely because Putin wants to negotiate something broader than Ukraine. It's not just Ukraine, but the entire European security architecture, post-Soviet security architecture he wants to talk about, and he feels he can talk about it with the US only. In terms of the Bosphorus, I think people think that Turkey can close it and open it as it goes, but the Montreux Convention is very clear. And I understand, I'm completely emphatic to Ukrainian demands on this because we've seen Russian ships, Navy ships, pass by the Bosphorus over the past few weeks, moving from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, to Sevastopol and other areas. But the truth is, Montreux ties Turkey's hands, and unless Turkey itself is at war, it has to allow countries that have a coastline to the Black Sea from the Bosphorus. Now, there could be, a question of what Turkey will do if there was a NATO ship, NATO or US ship that wanted to go into the Black Sea region. That's a valid question. But I think when it comes to Russian Navy, it has no option but to keep the straits open.
Thank you very much. And I have a question for Ambassador Herbst. So, Ambassador, they are asking why has the West left it so long to align many players and lay down some red lines for Russia? Russian hybrid aggression has been going on for some time against many countries.
That's a very good question. I think the answer is human nature. People, especially in Europe, have lived through an absolutely idyllic period of history since the end of the Cold War. And they got used to assuming that this period of peace and prosperity, largely the absence of any threats, was the normal state of affairs. And so people in the West, especially in Europe, but also in the United States, were very slow to realize the challenge of Putin's foreign policy. Professor Stent is absolutely right. Putin's objectives were clear since Munich of 2007, the February speech. But then when Moscow launched a cyber attack on Estonia, the West averted its eyes. Ditto with Georgia in the summer of 2008. Ditto with Crimea in February of 2014. And, even when they began their war in Donbass in the spring of 2014, Europe was unwilling to put serious sanctions down until the shoot down of MH17. So only slowly have people realized the threat. in Europe and in the United States, the exception, of course, of the East European countries, whose very existence depends upon a clear understanding of Moscow's ambitions. But little by little, the West has come to understand. So, we had the serious sanctions for Donbass in 2014 after MH17. And now, for the first time, and you have to give, well, I've faulted the Biden administration on a variety of points. They've understood before Moscow launched this latest aggression that the aggression was coming, and they were prepared for it. And they deserve great credit for that. And while our European allies were a little bit slow on this, they also came along, and that's credit to them. And again, to the Biden team for helping to encourage this. But of course, you're right. We should have been doing a lot more 8 years ago. And I've been in the vanguard of those who've been arguing that with only limited success, although more success lately.
Thank you very much. And I now have a question for Ambassador Marchenko. So they are asking, Ukrainian and Russian people have strong social and cultural relationship. However, we also know that this is not the first time Russia is not respecting Ukrainian sovereignty. How does this time differ than other times? What would be your call for Russian people to stop Putin's aggression?
Well, the answer is pretty obvious. If Russian people consider us their friends, I'm not talking about brothers. That's a bit of an uncalled for word in this situation. But if they want friendly relations with us, they have to ask their leaders to consider acting differently from the way they are acting now. I think that there are many people in Russia who oppose what Putin is doing and what his regime are doing. There are indications that many people in Russia actually strongly oppose all this. And a very good company of famous cultural figures recently wrote a minimum of 2 letters signed by 100 or so people to Putin to reverse his policies. However, how much will this be worth in the eyes of Putin? That's, I think, an open question and more of a rhetorical one. Of course, our message is always that we never want any war with anyone, much less we want war with our neighbors. And I think that's very important for them to understand, contrary to what their propaganda is trying to drive into their heads day and night. I think that the Russian media is more dedicated to Ukraine than to anything else. They hardly ever speak about whatever is happening on their vast territories than they're talking about my country. So yeah, the general question, of course, the general answer to this question is, please stop. That's the main message.
Thank you very much. I have another question for you, sir. So there are rumors that Americans are now arming the small militias in Ukraine against the possible invasion. If the invasion of Russia moves beyond Donbass region, can we see a civil war in Ukraine?
Well, for one, I have never heard of anything like this. The United States is dealing with the Ukrainian government, and it is dealing with the Ukrainian government quite open and in a very transparent manner. As a matter of fact, we are receiving cargoes upon cargoes upon cargoes of United States military assistance, the armaments and everything. And we have received a lot of training from the United States and other NATO countries lately. There is never any talk about militias, and I'm just wondering where that question comes from, because which militias are we talking about? There are no serious formations of any kind in Ukrainian territory that could be called militias in traditional sense, because if they are talking about volunteer battalions, they have all been long integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces, and the response to the singular command that comes from the Kiev defense authorities. So the general question is no. The general answer is no to this question. United States is dealing with the Ukrainian government.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. We have a few questions on Europe's stance in the crisis. So I would first like to start with Professor Stent. This question was asked to you. Where do Italy, Spain, and Greece stand in this conflict? And what should they particularly do about this conflict?
Well, as far as I know, the European Union has imposed sanctions on Russia. I think the sanctions are from yesterday, and there may be more today. And in that sense, all European Union members have agreed to this. So that's where they stand. Now, Italy, for instance, has, and Spain, they have somewhat less antagonistic relations with Russia. The same goes for Greece. There was some controversy a couple of weeks ago now when as the crisis was brewing, a group of Italian industrialists held a Zoom meeting with President Putin to talk about further investment in Russia. I mean, traditionally, those three countries have been more wary about having such an antagonistic relationship with Russia, and they see Russia somewhat differently given where they're geographically located. But that's true of the European Union does not have uniform views of Russia. Obviously, the Baltic states and Poland have one particular set of views given their own history, Italy, Spain, and Greece have a different view. So do Germany and France. But I think what you're seeing here, what is interesting and almost unusual, is this EU unity on sanctions against Russia, despite their different perceptions of Russia. And that, of course, would even include Hungary, which does have a closer relationship with Russia, because issues like violating a country's territorial integrity and denigrating its sovereignty, which is obviously what President Putin has done about Ukraine, that can refer to any European country. We have not had a major war in Europe since 1945. The European Union was partly created to make sure that didn't happen again. And so what is happening now in Ukraine, is a potential threat to all of those countries.
Thank you very much, Professor. Asli, I would like to ask you two more questions on Europe's stance in the crisis, and then we are going to end our discussion. They are asking, what does the invasion of Ukraine mean for European security? How could this development affect the European Union's security strategy? And if sanctions do not stop Russian aggression, what would EU's next step be?
It's no secret that countries formerly in the Eastern Bloc, but who are now within EU or NATO, are very nervous. You see already Poland and Slovenia, Slovakia, and also the Baltic countries extremely nervous about the meaning of this Ukraine crisis, because they can see that it's not only about Ukraine. Yes, Putin has some historic claims on Ukraine, and he's made it very clear, both in the article he wrote last July and over Christmas, and recently in his speech the other day. But it's far beyond that. He's also made it very clear that he wants to redesign and question European security architecture that had solidified, that had crystallized in the 1990s, when Russia was at its weakest. Now that it's feeling strong, Putin feels that countries in the former post-Soviet space, and certainly countries that were part of the Soviet Union, ought to be Russia's sphere of influence. There's a lot of push from Baltic states and from Eastern European countries for EU to do more. And I think EU has heard that. And that was a very important test that the European Union passed early on. The next stage would be actually doing stuff when it comes to defense and defense strategy, defense spending, and all of that, because I think Ambassador Herbst was right. Over the past few decades, in particular over the past decade, Europeans were happy to contract out their defense, the defense part of the transatlantic unity to the transatlantic alliance, to the US. and sort of focus on all the other nicer topics, including climate change, including, you know, including peace, including sort of cultural issues, et cetera, et cetera. But it's now clear that they need to think harder on defense relationship as well. I think, did you ask me another question, or am I missing?
The question was, what would EU's next step be if the sanctions don't work?
I think that EU's next step would be solidifying the defense arrangements with Eastern European countries, particularly Poland and Hungary and others that are, and the Baltics that are feeling very insecure right now.
Thank you very much. That was Asli Aydintasbas, Senior Fellow at the European Council and Foreign Relations and Washington Post columnist. Joining me today, my other guests were Andry Marchenko, Deputy Head of Ukrainian Mission in the United Kingdom, Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and former US Ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan, and Professor Angela Stent, Senior Advisor to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much for joining me tonight's discussion on Russia-Ukraine tensions. Are we moving towards the armed conflict hosted by the Circle Foundation? Thank you and see you another time.